Hi everyone, English 4101, my undergraduate medieval seminar. This first video, I'm going to try to do one of these every Monday. This is introducing you a little bit to Philo of Alexandria's work, Every Good Man is Free. So I'm going to walk you through some of this. First, just a bit about Philo of Alexandria and his world. He's born about 2,040 years ago, and then dies in the 40th year of our era. So BCE, CE, before Common Era, or BC or AD, right? Depending on how you want to abbreviate that. He's born in Alexandria, which is in the Roman province of Egypt. So it had been Egyptian, then it had been conquered by the Ptolemaic Greeks, and then conquered by the Romans. He himself is Jewish, and he writes in Greek. If we look at his works, he doesn't really draw on Latin literature. He doesn't draw on Egyptian culture or literature. He draws on his own Jewish biblical background from what's the Jewish scriptures, not from the so-called New Testament, because that doesn't exist yet, and also from Greek philosophy. So he wrote a great deal. It's mostly biblical commentary and allegory, but it's an attempt to try to make the Bible as he knew it more in line with Greek philosophy. So if you read his works on Genesis or the life of Moses, and you know much about Greek philosophy, you'll see that the two of them are kind of syncretized. He tries to make them harmonize because he's very invested in the excellence of Greek culture. And then he has more straight up philosophical works like Whether Brute Animals Possess Reason, which is a work that incidentally survives only in Arminian, tells you something about the language mixing of the ancient world, and this work that we read today, Every Good Man is Free. He also wrote some justifications of Jewish law. So he's not simply saying that the Greeks are better, he's trying to put them together. So this work is about the relationship between freedom and slavery. And as I said in the last class, the Roman Empire is a slavocracy. It's an economy that runs on, among other things, slavery. And the nature of slavery and the way it operates is going to differ from area to area in the Roman Empire. Egypt is not a place that's dominated by slavery in agricultural work. It's not determined, defined by field labor, whatever you might know from the book of Exodus. Most slavery, at least from Ptolemaic Greek times through to Philo's day at least, is household slavery. So the interesting thing is that although he's writing in an area that's not defined by the kind of slavery that you're going to find, say, in Roman Italy, he's still going to be intimately associated and surrounded by enslaved people because he's from a wealthy and important family. And so the kind of people who are going to do the work around his house are often going to be unfree. So he's going to be looking at them, maybe they're going to be helping him fetch things that he needs to write or fluffing up the cushions on his chair while he's writing about the philosophical differences between slavery and freedom. That's something I want you to keep in mind as you're reading this text. So I got that data on slavery, incidentally, from a work, Slavery in Greco-Roman Egypt. It's a chapter in the book Law and Legal Practice in Egypt, etc. That is, I didn't just Google it. I went to an academic database and I tracked down an authoritative source so I can find some good data from real scholars, people who've spent a lifetime studying the ancient world. So this is what I recommend you do. Don't just Google it. Look for it someplace where you can trust the information. So this little talk today about Every Good Man is Free, it's going to go through 5 things, right? I'm just going to talk briefly about the chief argument. I'm going to talk about animals and common people in it. I'm going to talk a little bit about women. I'm going to talk about the Essenes or the Essenes, however you want to pronounce it. And I'm going to talk about the nature of reason in this, which I think is weirdly about lack of movement, stability, or stolidity even, rather than making judgments. So this is something I want you to keep in mind. This is how we're going to go in this little talk. I have an illustration here. It's the front cover of volume 9 of the Loeb Classical Library's facing page translations of Philo. That's where the translation you read for today comes from. So facing page means it has the original language on one side, on the left side of the page, which is Greek, and then a translation, in this case, into modern English on the right side. And so there are many volumes of this in the Loeb Classical Library. The green volumes are in Greek. The red volumes are from Latin. So Philo belongs to the Greek side. The chief argument is that people are enslaved when they succumb to the passions. People who are free of desire and free of the connection to this mutable world where things are always changing, those are the people who are actually slaves. Again, it's a very strange argument to make in some ways in a culture that has enslaved people, to say that true slaves are people who are, you might be rich, you might be powerful, but if you're a slave to your passions and to your riches, you are the actual slave. So you can think about who the audience for this work is, who's going to be reading it, who's going to have the power to act on it. So let me just read a few key passages to illustrate that. For he who with a mean and slavish spirit puts his hand to mean and slavish actions contrary to his own proper judgment is a slave indeed. Anybody who's tossed about by all mortal things, that person is really a slave. Those in whom anger or desire or any other passion, or again, any insidious vice holds sway, are entirely enslaved, while all those whose life is regulated by law are free. Incidentally, then, freedom is not the freedom to do anything you like. Freedom is about following right law and right reason. It's about getting right with philosophy and getting right with God. It's finding one true path and sticking to it, right? So freedom in this case is a very particular kind of freedom, and slavery in this work is a very particular way of thinking about slavery. It's a very common argument in the ancient world. Many, many important ancient thinkers make arguments like this, including the Apostle Paul in the Christian scriptures has many arguments about freedom and law that participate in this Stoic paradox, is what it's called, the paradox that every good man is free and every vice-ridden man is a slave. So to make this argument, he attacks certain groups, primarily most people. Most people, because they're not philosophers and they can't understand paradoxes, are themselves not able to ascend to the level of freedom that Philo was talking about. The relationship between philosophy and esotericism, an esoteric philosophy, that is something that's available only to a small group of people, is very tight indeed in the ancient world. It's really often thought of as not true philosophy if most people can understand it. And you can trace a line of that through, say, to the present day, to literary theory or whatever. And in attacking the common people, he attacks them oftentimes as animals. Animals in a lot of ancient thought, but not all ancient thought, are understood as driven by their senses, as irrational. If they were a Christian, they thought that animals didn't have an immortal soul, that is, that they wouldn't resurrect. They made all these arguments without any kind of laboratory testing. And in making these arguments, primarily they were trying to say things about themselves, saying that I am not an animal, I'm a rational being, I have a life that matters in itself, you can't kill and eat me ethically, and that God loves me in a way that is going to cause me to be with him eternally, and that animals are not these things. And it's interesting then that you have philosophers animalizing common people. So here's a kind of common statement about that. For just as goats and oxen and sheep are led by goat herds and ox herds and shepherds, and flocks and herds cannot possibly give orders to herdsmen, so too the multitude who are like cattle require a master and a ruler, and have for their leaders men of virtue appointed to the office of governing the herd. Homer often calls kings shepherds of the people. Notice the way that he's using Greek literature to help prove his case. He mixes the Bible and Greek literature and Greek philosophy all together. So this is the idea that basically, if we're talking about freedom versus slavery, and that freedom is a certain attitude towards the passions, most people are not only not free, they're basically animals, right? So this is something we can talk about in class. And then this also applies in certain ways to women. He doesn't talk much about women in this text, but he has the attitude towards women that you often find in ancient and indeed many modern philosophers. So here's a classic moment. I have often myself seen pretty little slave girls with a natural gift for wheedling words, who with these two sources of strength, beauty of face and charm of speech, storm the hearts of their owners. And this is saying that the person who owns this enslaved girl is in fact enslaved by her because she's so beautiful. Now, if you are that enslaved girl and you're there as a household slave, which probably means all kinds of terrible things, it would be kind of outrageous to be told, actually, you're the one who's enslaving this person. So this is something to bear in mind. What is the relationship between desire and sexual desire and philosophy in a text like this? And where do women, in particular, where do attractive girls and young women fit into philosophy like this? Philo is not outside the common run of thinkers in this regard. And once we start condemning desire, start condemning the flesh, start condemning sex, often what happens is that certain groups of people are identified with these qualities, thought of as fundamentally fleshly, fundamentally desirous, fundamentally sexual, and they're condemned for that. And that often splits along gender lines. And men who act on their desires are often understood as effeminate because they're driven by desire, even if they are what we modern people might call heterosexual. So we can talk about that in class too. And then I want to mention a bit of historical data, which is he's talking about a particular Jewish sect, probably 4,000 people or so, who emerged in ancient Judea, the Roman province of Palestine, about 250 BCE, so about 2,200 years ago, and thrived roughly until about 70 CE, so not quite 2,000 years ago. And some people associate them with the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls. That, the jury's still out on that, whether that's the case. But the Essenes are the one group that Philo offers who collectively lead a philosophical life. And there's a couple things that are really striking about them. They don't have personal property, they have communal property. Their doors are open to anybody who is willing to take on their ideas. They are very peaceful, they don't engage in commerce, they don't engage in war, and they don't have slavery. This is the key thing. Not a single slave is to be found among them, but all are free, exchanging services with each other, and they denounce the owners of slaves, not merely for their injustice and outraging the law of equality, but also for their impiety and annulling the statute of nature, who mother-like has born and reared all men alike and created them genuine brothers, not in mere name, but in very reality, etc. So this is the one moment of what we might call abolitionism in this text, to say that if we're saying that the truly virtuous man is free and the truly vice-ridden man is enslaved, well, what about actual slaves? Well, if the truly virtuous man is not attached to personal property, they're not attached to wealth, and they're not attached to honor and all these changeable things, then they don't need to or want to own people, because those are things you acquire when you want to demonstrate that you're a powerful person, or that you're a rich person, or you want to increase your richness, or you want to act out your desires on some individual who's helpless to resist you. And so it's interesting that we get this lack of slavery, actual lack of slavery in this group of people who are the perfect philosophers. Do they not have slaves because they're perfect philosophers? Or are they perfect philosophers because they don't have slaves and private property? The cause and effect there is something maybe we might talk about in class. I want to say that this may not be a record of the way the actual Essenes lived. To my mind, I'm familiar with the kind of material that Philo might have been reading on this point, and it sounds like the way that Greeks talked about virtuous groups of philosophers, which they often located in the Far East, in modern-day Pakistan or India. And I think that Philo is reading that material and Judaizing it. And so we can maybe talk about that more in class as well. And then the final thing I want to mention is the way that reason and freedom operate in this text, because reason is the thing that I'm particularly interested in as a scholar, the history of this idea of reason. And what you can see is that reason is not associated in this particular text with judgment, with what we might call thinking, with calculation, with building things, with inventing things, with writing things, with language even. Language is something he kind of looks down on. What he associates reason with is resistance, about something happening to you and you don't respond to it. You don't allow it to carry you away. It's even kind of a lower level than resistance. It's just about not moving. So here's a classic moment of that, which I'll read for you, about where he likens it to athletes who are wrestling in public, really kind of a sporting event. He will finally quit the arena without a crown in a state of exhaustion and collapse. This is the one who's attacking his opponent. While the object of his attack, a mass of closely packed flesh, rigid and solid, full of the wiriness of the true athlete, his sinews taut from end to end, firm as a piece of rock or iron, will yield not a whit to the blows, but by his stark and stubborn endurance will break down utterly the strength of his adversary and end by winning complete victory. Much the same is, as it seems to me, the case of the virtuous man, his soul strongly fortified with a resolution firmly founded on reason. He compels the employer of violence to give up an exhaustion. So we tend to think of reason as someone who is maybe able to calculate well, to think about statistics well, or maybe through reason able to invent a thing. But Philo's version of reason is really about being like a rock, something that can't be moved. And we can talk about that in class as well. I think it's an extremely weird way to think about reason, but it's an extremely common way to think about it as well, as we're going to see as we read through Philo, as we read through Boethius, as we read through Ibn Tufayl. So I look forward to talking to you tomorrow.